Hi guys, my name is Gina Scheer. Welcome to EarthX 2023. Today we are in the Hello Studios podcast booth with our special guest. Do you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Emily Van Buren. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Texas in Arlington.
I love it.
Our lab studies coral immunity. So what that means is that we partner with a bunch of different labs across the United States, and we are looking to understand how corals face different disease events.
Wow.
Yeah.
How interesting. I have not had anybody come across the hot seat yet today that has been in this field. So I'm super intrigued to learn about it. Yeah. And you brought us a little eyepiece here.
Yes. So
do you mind telling us about that?
Yes. So this is a Parietes coral.
Okay.
So this is a stony coral. So that's why it's very stony complexure.
Yeah, sure.
And they actually will grow just like this and into big, almost human size colonies.
Wow.
Each of these little circles that we have here are where a polyp, an individual, would be. And then they will be one big community that will grow and grow and support a whole reef system.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
would
incredible.
You like to touch it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay, so now I'm very intrigued. Mm-hmm. How do you even become so educated on coral when it's so hard to access when we're on land?
Yes, absolutely. So corals, we can study them in aquarium systems. So when we do our experiments, we actually go to the Virgin Islands. We collect these corals from their reef systems and we bring them back into essentially big bins, and they will live in those bins for about 2 weeks while we perform our experiments. So,
wow, how fascinating. Where you said U.S. Virgin Islands?
U.S. Virgin Islands,
Where do you guys pull from there?
So primarily St. John or St. Croix.
Okay.
So any of those reef systems on those islands is where we will primarily study.
Those are some beautiful waters over there. I've been to St. Croix, haven't been to St. John yet. So how does that process even work? Like, how are they able to pull those from there and move them back to Texas, for instance, or wherever they take them to?
Yeah, so when we do our experiments, we actually expose them to a coral that is sick. So there are two kind of big diseases that we study in our lab. There's white plague disease and stony coral tissue loss disease. So stony coral tissue loss disease is the more prevalent disease that's in the Virgin Islands right now. It started off in the Florida Keys off the coast of Miami and has traveled down through the Caribbean, coming up to Mexico.
What causes that?
So that's the big question, isn't it? Yeah. That's part of what our lab is trying to understand is what is actually causing this. There's two big ideas that it could be a disease of the algal symbiont that lives within the coral, and they're getting sick and then proceeding to get the coral itself sick. Or there are some people who think it might be a bacteria that's infecting the coral. But either way, there are some treatments that have been studied. So you can actually use amoxicillin and put a little paste on their lesions, and it normally stops a lesion from growing.
That's so wild.
Yeah.
That's so crazy. What made you want to get into this? I mean, it's such a niche market.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of being educated on the coral and the reef system. So what made you want to dive into that?
Yeah, so I actually got my master's degree in bioinformatics. And essentially what that means is I use computers to study biology, specifically people's genes. And so I started in the human health field studying parasites. But then I got connected with a coral researcher and kind of ended up here.
Wow.
So a lot of the techniques that are used in cancer research to understand biomarkers for people who might be more resilient to cancer or more susceptible to cancers. We're trying to apply the same techniques and put that right into our corals so that we know which ones are going to be a little bit more resilient to those disease events.
So fascinating.
Yeah.
And can you break down in English terms?
Yes, of course.
Of how the coral affects the ocean, number one, and then ultimately how it affects the environment and then us as humans.
Yes, so corals are what establishes a whole reef. When you look at a reef and you normally see all those really big rock structures, that's actually a living organism, and that's our corals there. And corals support a ton of marine life. It's estimated that about 95% of marine fish, part of their life cycle is on a reef.
Wow.
So they are very important as an ecosystem setup for most marine life that we know. And so with more diseases or more bleaching event, you're reducing that area where all these other marine systems are going to be dependent on for any part of their life cycle.
Wow. So fascinating. And what does that life cycle look like for us? Like, how would you relate it back to the human?
Yeah, so there are a lot of industries and like just our general lifestyle that's supported by these reefs. So if you love to eat fish, you're going to want a reef to be protected.
Right.
Reefs also actually protect most of our coastlines. So the Florida Reef Tract actually protects a lot of the Florida Keys during hurricane events. They actually reduce about $1.1 billion, I think, in damages is the new stat from NOAA. So they really do provide a lot of support for us humans.
That's wild to think about. What can we do to help protect these reefs?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest things when we talk about protecting reefs is thinking about our carbon intake. So carbon intake is talked about a lot with our carbon footprint. Carbon is one of those things that's going to cause ocean acidification events, and that's what's going to cause these bleaching in these little guys. So if we can be very conscious about our carbon intake, that will also be one of the best ways that we can help the coral.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow. Such a full circle, but something that not everyone, I mean, I'm sure you think about it all the time, but not everyone always thinks about, and it's so cool to be educated on it. And I mean, it's been one of the coolest things about EarthX for myself is to be educated on all these little aspects, or what seems to be little aspects within our world and like our environment. But for the sustainability, like makes such a huge impact. And coral is not one that I would typically think of.
Absolutely. It's not something that you think of, especially like where we are in DFW. We're so landlocked.
Right.
It's not something that we see on our day-to-day life, but it is a huge part of our ecosystem. Yeah. And we can help out just being in DFW.
That's so cool. What do you see for you long term? I mean, what's your goal within being able to study this and find out the diseases that are carried within the coral?
Yeah, so when we see a disease event in corals right now, our big thing is to just kind of pull them out of the ocean. And that's not a sustainable thing to be able to do. Yeah. And we're also risking a lot of ecosystems and ourselves by pulling out all those important structures.
Sure.
So, but the cool thing about corals is that for some of the species, you can propagate them. So kind of like a succulent, how you can take a leaf off and then you can grow a whole new succulent. Yeah. You can do that with some corals.
Interesting.
So when they're housed in these different aquariums across the country, we can get information about their genotypes. So we can know if one's going to be more resilient than another one, and we can grow more of those corals. So I would like to be part of that process of figuring out what makes a coral so resilient to a disease, so that way we can grow more of those corals and keep their biodiversity and bring them back into the ocean.
That's so cool. Yeah. I'm sure, like, I don't know, just thinking about this whole concept of being able to replant new corals, as you were saying, and even finding out, like, I mean, is it difficult to know about different coral and maybe a disease in a different part of the world, and then being able to essentially take that sick coral out, but not knowing the data and the history of what it was like there before and what happened to that coral before.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a bunch of people who work on exactly those types of questions. And it's really important. That's why we love to do surveys on reefs.
Sure.
So know who was there a year ago, 2 years ago, before a disease event happens, and then come in and see who's there after a disease event.
So crazy. Yeah. To be able to like track underwater like that is mind-blowing.
There's a lot of, if you love diving, there's ways to become citizen scientists so that you can actually be a part of that process.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, as we wrap up here, do you mind telling the viewers how they can stay in touch with you specifically and any projects that you have going on in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said before, I'm part of the Mid-Lars Lab. So you can go onto our website for the Mid-Lars Lab. We are part of UTA Science. And on the Mid-Lars Lab, if you go to people, if you're specifically interested in what I'm doing, you can find my picture and my website from there.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out and joining us today.
Thank you for having
me. Educating us on all of the coral.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.